Hello, amazing history explorers. Welcome back to our channel. Before we journey back to the Viking Age and uncover one of history's most fascinating stories, I need your help to keep bringing you these incredible historical discoveries. Please hit that like button if you're excited to learn something that will completely change how you see Viking women. Subscribe to join our community of history enthusiasts, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love connecting with fellow history lovers from every corner of our planet. Now, let's step back in time to discover what really happened to women accused of practicing magic in the Viking Age. And trust me, the truth will absolutely stun you. In the mist-covered fjords of 9th century Scandinavia, where the northern lights dance across star-filled skies and ancient forests whisper with the voices of spirits, there existed women whose power commanded both reverence and awe throughout Viking society. These were the Volvas, the seeresses whose very presence could alter the course of battles, predict the fate of kings, and bridge the gap between the world of mortals and the realm of the gods. Far from being outcasts or victims of persecution, these practitioners of cedar magic held positions of extraordinary respect and influence that would astonish anyone familiar with later European witch hunts. The Volva, whose name translates to wand-wed or staff carrier, represented one of the most prestigious spiritual roles available to women in Viking Age society. These remarkable women traveled from settlement to settlement, their distinctive staffs marking them as practitioners of cedar, a sophisticated magical tradition that encompassed prophecy, healing, weather control, and the manipulation of fate itself. When a Volva arrived at a farmstead or village, she was immediately offered the seat of honor at the head table, regardless of her social background or the status of those she was visiting. Even the most powerful jarls and chieftains would defer to her authority in matters of spiritual significance. The practice of cedar magic was intrinsically connected to the feminine sphere of Viking society, drawing its power from associations with textile work, particularly spinning and weaving. This connection was far from coincidental. In Norse mythology, the Norns, the three sisters who controlled the fate of gods and mortals alike, were depicted as weavers who spun the threads of destiny at the base of Yggdrasil, the world tree. The Volva's staff, often resembling a distaff used in spinning, symbolized her ability to manipulate these cosmic threads and alter the fabric of reality itself. This powerful imagery reinforced the understanding that women possess a natural connection to the forces that govern life, death, and the passage of time. Archaeological evidence reveals the extraordinary status accorded to these magical practitioners throughout Scandinavian territories. Burial sites in the Viking Age contain graves of women interred with ornate staffs, ritual implements, and exotic goods from distant lands, clear indicators of their elevated position within society. The famous Oseberg ship burial in Norway, containing 2 women buried with magnificent grave goods including elaborate textiles, carved wooden artifacts, and precious metals, demonstrates a wealth and influence that some spiritual practitioners could accumulate during their lifetimes. These discoveries reveal that rather than being marginalized figures, Volvas often commanded resources and respect that rivaled those of the most powerful warriors and merchants of their age. The goddess Freya herself served as the divine patron, an exemplar of cedar magic, lending celestial authority to the practices of mortal Volvas. According to Norse mythology preserved in the Ynglinga saga, it was Freya who first introduced the art of cedar to the Aesir gods and personally instructed Odin in its mysteries. This divine endorsement elevated the practice of magic far above mere folk tradition, establishing it as a sophisticated spiritual discipline worthy of the gods themselves. Freya's mastery of cedar encompassed not only prophecy and healing, but also the ability to travel between worlds, communicate with the dead, and influence the outcomes of battles, powers that mortal Volvas aspire to emulate in their own practice. The respect accorded to Volvas extended beyond spiritual matters into practical governance of Viking communities. These women were frequently consulted before major decisions, including military campaigns, trade expeditions, and matters of law. Their ability to perceive hidden truths and foresee future consequences made them invaluable advisors to rulers who understood that success in Viking society depended as much on spiritual insight as on martial prowess. The Volva's word could determine whether a proposed voyage would bring prosperity or disaster, whether a marriage alliance would strengthen or weaken a clan, and whether the gods favor a particular course of action. The training and initiation of Volvas followed established traditions that emphasized both spiritual development and practical skill acquisition. Young women who showed aptitude for seed are often apprentice themselves to experienced practitioners, learning the intricate rituals, herbal knowledge, and trance techniques required for effective magical work. This education could span many years and included mastery of runic writing, knowledge of healing plants, understanding of astronomical cycles, and the development of the psychic abilities necessary for prophetic vision. The completion of this training marked a woman's transformation from ordinary mortal to sacred intermediary between the human and divine realms. The integration of magical practitioners into the fabric of Viking society reveals a worldview fundamentally different from later European attitudes towards supernatural practices. Rather than viewing magic as inherently suspicious or dangerous, Viking communities understood cedar as an essential tool for navigating the challenges of existence in a harsh and unpredictable world. The Volvas who practiced this ancient art were not feared as corrupting influences, but celebrated as guardians of wisdom whose abilities could mean the difference between prosperity and catastrophe for entire communities. The legal status of women in Viking society provided a foundation that supported and protected the activities of magical practitioners. Viking women enjoyed remarkable legal rights for their historical period, including the ability to own property, inherit land, initiate divorce proceedings, and represent themselves in legal disputes. These protections extended equally to Volvas, ensuring that their spiritual calling did not compromise their material security or social standing. Many Volvas accumulated considerable wealth through their services, accepting payment in the form of livestock, precious metals, exotic goods, and land grants from grateful clients. Their economic independence reinforced their spiritual authority and enabled them to maintain the traveling lifestyle essential to their calling. The seasonal rhythms of Viking society created regular opportunities for Volvas to demonstrate their abilities and strengthen their community connections. Winter months, when travel was difficult and communities turned inward, provided ideal conditions for the extended rituals and ceremonies that were central to seed practice. During these dark months, Volvas would conduct elaborate seances designed to communicate with deceased ancestors, predict the outcomes of spring planting, and provide guidance for the coming year's activities. These gatherings served not only spiritual functions, but also important social purposes, strengthening community bonds and providing entertainment during the long Scandinavian winter. The relationship between Volvas and established religious practices demonstrates the sophisticated theological understanding that characterized Viking spirituality. Rather than competing with the worship of traditional Norse gods, seed or magic complemented and enhanced conventional religious observances. Volvas serve as intermediaries who could facilitate communication between mortals and deities, interpret divine will, and ensure that proper rituals were performed to maintain cosmic balance. Their presence at religious festivals and seasonal celebrations was considered essential for ensuring the effectiveness of communal worship and the continued favor of the gods. The practical applications of seed or magic addressed the full spectrum of concerns that occupied Viking communities throughout the annual cycle. Volvas provided healing services that combined herbal remedies with spiritual intervention, treating ailments that range from physical injuries to psychological disturbances. Their weather magic could bring favorable winds for sailing expeditions or protective storms to discourage enemy raids. Love magic helped arrange successful marriages and resolve domestic disputes, while protective spells safeguarded homes, livestock, and traveling merchants. This comprehensive range of services made Volvas indispensable members of their communities rather than peripheral figures operating on society's margins. The training centers and networks that supported Volv activities revealed a sophisticated institutional framework that sustained magical practices throughout Scandinavia. Experienced practitioners established informal schools where they could pass their knowledge to the next generation, ensuring the continuity of traditions and the maintenance of high standards within the profession. These educational relationships often spanned decades and created lasting bonds between teachers and students that provided mutual support and protection throughout their careers. The networks of Volvas that emerged from these training relationships facilitated the exchange of knowledge, the coordination of services, and the development of new techniques and approaches to magical practice. Archaeological evidence from major Viking Age trading centers demonstrates the international connections and cultural exchange that characterize Volv activities. Graves of magical practitioners contain artifacts from distant lands, including amber from the Baltic, silk from the Byzantine Empire, and exotic stones from far-flung territories. These discoveries indicate that Volvas were active participants in the extensive trade networks that connected Scandinavia with the broader medieval world. Their spiritual services were apparently valued not only by local communities, but also by foreign merchants and diplomats who encountered them during commercial and political exchanges. The theological foundations of Seed of Magic reveal profound insights into Viking Age understanding of divine feminine power and its earthly manifestations. The practice of magic was not merely tolerated within Norse religious traditions, but actively celebrated as a reflection of cosmic principles that govern the universe itself. The goddess Freya, as the supreme practitioner and teacher of Seed, embodied the concept that magical power represented a fundamental aspect of divine authority rather than a corrupting influence that challenged established order. This theological perspective provided unshakable religious justification for the activities of mortal Volvas and elevated their work to the level of sacred duty. The complex mythology surrounding Freya's introduction of Seed to the gods illustrates the sophisticated theological reasoning that supported magical practices in Viking society. According to preserved traditions, Freya's arrival among the Aesir as part of the peace settlement between the Aesir and Vanir brought revolutionary new spiritual technologies that enhanced the god's ability to perceive and influence cosmic events. Her personal instruction of Odin and Seed techniques established a direct divine precedent for the transmission of magical knowledge from female teachers to male students, legitimizing similar relationships in mortal society. This mythological framework provided Volvas with unassailable religious authority for their teaching activities and their interactions with male community leaders. The practical manifestations of divine feminine power through Volva activities created tangible benefits that reinforced community support for magical practitioners. The ability to predict weather patterns enabled farmers to optimize planting and harvesting schedules, potentially meaning the difference between abundance and famine for entire regions. Healing practices that combined herbal knowledge with spiritual intervention provided medical care that was often more effective than purely physical treatments. Prophetic visions that warned of impending raids or natural disasters allowed communities to prepare defenses or seek shelter, saving countless lives throughout the Viking Age. These documented successes created a feedback loop that continuously reinforced respect for Volva abilities and encouraged continued support for their activities. The relationship between Volvas and the natural world reflected deeply held beliefs about feminine connection to cosmic forces. Viking culture understood women as possessing innate sensitivity to the rhythms of nature, the cycles of life and death, and the subtle energies that connected all living things. This perceived connection was not viewed as making women inferior to men, but rather as granting them access to knowledge and abilities that complemented male strengths in warfare and leadership. The Volva's ability to commune with spirits, interpret natural signs, and manipulate environmental conditions was seen as a natural extension of feminine attributes rather than an aberrant deviation from proper gender roles. The economic dimensions of Volva practice demonstrate the practical value that Viking communities placed on magical services. Successful practitioners could command substantial fees for their services, accumulating wealth that rivaled that of accomplished merchants or skilled craftsmen. The willingness of clients to pay these fees indicates genuine belief in the effectiveness of magical interventions rather than mere superstitious adherence to traditional practices. The economic success of Volvas also enabled them to maintain the independence necessary for their spiritual calling, as they were not dependent on male relatives for financial support. This economic autonomy reinforced their spiritual authority and enabled them to serve their communities without compromising their integrity or effectiveness. The integration of Volvas into the legal and political structures of Viking society reveals the extent to which magical authority was accepted as a legitimate form of power. Volvas frequently served as advisors to rulers. Their counsel sought on matters ranging from military strategy to diplomatic negotiations. Their ability to perceive hidden motivations and foresee the consequences of proposed actions made them valuable allies for leaders. The sophisticated social structures that supported Volva activities throughout Scandinavia reveal the extent to which magical practice was integrated into the fundamental fabric of Viking Age society. Rather than operating as isolated individuals dependent on their own resources and abilities, Volvas participated in extensive networks that provided mutual support, shared knowledge, and coordinated services across vast geographical areas. These professional associations function with remarkable efficiency despite the challenging communication and transportation conditions of the medieval period, demonstrating the organizational capabilities and strategic thinking that characterize successful magical practitioners. The apprenticeship systems that govern the transmission of seed or knowledge created lasting bonds between teachers and students that persisted throughout their professional careers. Master Volvas carefully selected promising candidates from among the young women who sought instruction, evaluating not only their innate psychic abilities, but also their character, intelligence, and dedication to the demanding spiritual disciplines required for effective practice. The training process could extend over many years and involve mastery of complex ritual procedures, extensive memorization of mythological and genealogical traditions, development of trance and meditation techniques, and acquisition of practical skills in herbalism, astronomy, and runic writing. This comprehensive education created practitioners who possessed both the technical competence and cultural authority necessary to serve effectively as spiritual guides for their communities. The seasonal migration patterns of Volvas created regular opportunities for professional development and knowledge exchange that enhanced the overall quality of magical services throughout Scandinavia. During the summer months when travel was feasible, experienced practitioners often journeyed to distant regions where they could learn new techniques, acquire exotic materials for their practice, and establish relationships with colleagues working in different cultural contexts. These professional exchanges facilitated the development of standardized practices and shared traditions that created consistency in Volvas services across the Norse world. The knowledge gained during these travels was subsequently transmitted to students and colleagues, creating a continuous process of innovation and improvement within the magical profession. The relationship between Volvas and the merchant networks that connected Scandinavia with distant lands demonstrates the international dimensions of magical practice. During the Viking Age, traders who encountered Volvas during their journeys often became clients of their services, seeking protective magic for dangerous voyages, prophetic guidance for commercial ventures, and healing treatments for injuries sustained during their travels. These commercial relationships provided Volvas with access to exotic materials and foreign knowledge that enhanced their practice, while simultaneously spreading awareness of Scandinavian magical traditions throughout the medieval world. The mutual benefits derived from these relationships encourage their continuation and expansion over time. The protective associations that formed among Volvas working in the same regions provided security and mutual aid that enabled them to maintain their independence despite the potential dangers of their traveling lifestyle. Groups of practitioners often coordinated their movements to ensure that experienced Volvas were available to provide assistance to colleagues who encountered difficulties during their journeys or professional activities. These support networks also serve defensive functions, as the combined spiritual power of multiple Volvas could provide protection against hostile forces that might threaten individual practitioners. The effectiveness of these protective associations reinforced community confidence in Volva abilities and encouraged continued support for their activities. The ceremonial gatherings that brought together Volvas from extensive geographical areas served important functions in maintaining professional standards and developing collective responses to changing social conditions. These assemblies, often held in conjunction with major religious festivals or seasonal celebrations, provided opportunities for practitioners to demonstrate their abilities, share innovations in technique and practice, and address challenges facing the magical profession as a whole. The collaborative rituals performed at these gatherings were believed to generate spiritual energies that benefited entire regions, reinforcing community appreciation for Volva contributions to collective welfare. The prestige associated with participation in these ceremonial events enhanced individual reputations and strengthened the overall influence of the magical profession within Viking society. The integration of Volvas into the diplomatic and military activities of Viking Age rulers demonstrates the extent to which magical authority was recognized as a legitimate form of political power. Chieftains and kings regularly consulted Volvas before undertaking major campaigns, seeking prophetic guidance about the likely outcomes of proposed actions and requesting protective magic for their forces. The presence of Volvas in military camps provided psychological support for warriors facing dangerous battles, while also serving practical functions, through healing services and weather magic. The formal recognition accorded to Volva Council in strategic planning and tactical decision-making indicates that their authority extended seamlessly from spiritual matters into practical concerns of warfare and statecraft. The gradual transformation of Scandinavian society during the later Viking Age and the subsequent period of Christianization reveals a remarkable durability of respect for feminine magical authority, even as traditional religious practices evolved. Rather than experiencing sudden persecution or systematic suppression, Volva traditions adapted to changing cultural conditions while maintaining their essential character and social significance. The process of religious conversion that swept through Scandinavia during the 10th and 11th centuries incorporated rather than eliminated many elements of traditional magical practice, creating syncretic traditions that preserved Volva knowledge within new theological frameworks. The documentation of Volva practices and literary sources compiled during the Christian period demonstrates the continued respect accorded to these traditions even after the formal adoption of new religious beliefs. The authors of sagas and mythological texts, writing under Christian patronage and for Christian audiences, nevertheless portrayed Volvas as figures worthy of admiration and respect rather than as dangerous practitioners of forbidden arts. This positive portrayal indicates that the integration of Volvas into Viking society had been so complete and their contributions so valuable that later generations continue to honor their memory even when their practices were no longer actively pursued. The archaeological evidence for continuity in burial practices and material culture associated with magical practitioners suggests that the transition away from traditional Volva activities occurred gradually over several centuries rather than through abrupt suppression. Graves from the late Viking Age and early medieval period continue to contain artifacts associated with magical practice, indicating that some individuals maintained these traditions even as broader social attitudes evolved. The persistence of these material markers suggests that the respect accorded to Volvas during the height of the Viking Age created lasting cultural attitudes that protected practitioners even during periods of religious and social change. The influence of Volva traditions on the development of medieval Scandinavian folk practices demonstrates the enduring impact of Viking Age magical systems on subsequent cultural evolution. Many of the healing traditions, seasonal celebrations, and protective rituals that characterize rural Scandinavian life well into the modern period can be traced back to practices originated or refined by Volvas during the Viking Age. The preservation of these traditions within Christian context indicates that their practical effectiveness and cultural significance were sufficient to ensure their survival despite changing religious frameworks. The international recognition accorded to Scandinavian magical traditions during the medieval period reflects the reputation for effectiveness and sophistication that Volva practices had achieved throughout the Viking Age. Foreign sources from various European and Middle Eastern cultures contain references to Nordic magical practitioners and their remarkable abilities, indicating that the influence of Volvas extended far beyond their homeland. These international testimonies provide independent confirmation of the respect and effectiveness that characterize Volva activities, and help explain why these traditions were able to maintain their influence even as political and religious conditions changed. The modern scholarly recognition of Volva contributions to Viking Age society represent a restoration of historical perspective that acknowledges the sophisticated spiritual and intellectual achievements of these remarkable women. Contemporary research has demonstrated that rather than being primitive folk practitioners operating on the margins of society, Volvas were highly educated professionals who possessed advanced knowledge in multiple fields including psychology, medicine, astronomy, and social dynamics. Their integration into the power structures of Viking society and their influence on political and military decision-making reveals them as significant historical figures whose contributions deserve recognition alongside those of more traditionally celebrated Viking Age personalities. The comparison between the treatment of magical practitioners in Viking Age Scandinavia and their counterparts in other medieval European societies highlights the exceptional character of Norse cultural attitudes toward feminine spiritual authority. While women accused of magical practices in many other regions face suspicion, persecution, and often execution, Volvas in Scandinavian societies enjoyed respect, protection, and integration into positions of significant social influence. This contrast demonstrates that the notorious witch hunts of later European history were not inevitable consequences a belief in magical practices, but rather reflected specific cultural and religious attitudes that were not universal during the medieval period. As we reach the end of this extraordinary journey through Viking Age history, we must fundamentally reconsider everything we thought we knew about the relationship between women, magic, and power in medieval European society. The Volvas of Scandinavia were not victims of persecution or practitioners of forbidden arts, but rather respected professionals whose abilities were considered essential for the proper functioning of their communities. Their integration into the social, economic, political, and religious structures of Viking society demonstrates a level of gender equality and spiritual sophistication that would not be matched in many European cultures for centuries to come. The evidence presented throughout these chapters reveals that accusations of witchcraft in Viking Age Scandinavia carried none of the negative connotations that would later characterize similar charges in other medieval societies. Rather than facing persecution, women who practiced cedar magic were sought out for their wisdom, compensated generously for their services, and accorded positions of honor that reflected their valuable contributions to community welfare. The respect shown to Volvas extended from ordinary farmers seeking healing for their livestock to kings requesting prophetic guidance before major battles, demonstrating the universal recognition of feminine magical authority throughout Viking society. This remarkable historical reality challenges modern assumptions about medieval attitudes toward women and magic, while providing inspiration for contemporary discussions about gender, spirituality, and social organization. The Volvas of the Viking Age demonstrate that alternative approaches to these fundamental human concerns have existed throughout history and continue to offer valuable insights for modern societies seeking more equitable and inclusive forms of social organization. Their legacy reminds us that the limitations placed on women's spiritual and intellectual contributions in many historical periods were cultural choices rather than natural inevitabilities, and that different choices remain possible in our own time. The story of Viking Age Volvas ultimately reveals a world where feminine wisdom was celebrated rather than suppressed, where magical practice enhanced rather than threatened social stability, and where women could achieve positions of genuine authority and influence through the development and application of their spiritual gifts. This extraordinary historical reality deserves to be widely known and carefully studied, as it provides both historical perspective on the diverse ways human societies have organized themselves and inspiration for continued efforts to create more just and equitable communities in our own era.